Sometimes the smallest gift carries the heaviest truth, and sometimes the quietest child changes the loudest room forever. The crystal chandeliers shimmered above the grand ballroom of Chicago's most prestigious charity gala, casting warm reflections across polished marble floors where influential executives, philanthropists, and journalists gathered in elegant evening attire. At the center of the stage stood Victoria Hayes, one of America's youngest billionaire CEOs, delivering a poised speech about innovation, opportunity, and giving back to the community. Her voice was calm, polished, and admired, yet behind her composed smile rested a loneliness that no magazine interview had ever captured. Near the back of the ballroom, Ethan Brooks adjusted the sleeve of his worn navy blazer as he knelt beside his 8-year-old daughter, Lily. He had accepted an invitation to the fundraiser only because the neighborhood community center where he volunteered had received 2 complimentary tickets. Expensive events were unfamiliar territory for a man who measured success by repaired toys, stocked food shelves, and children leaving with hopeful smiles instead of tears. Lily clutched a tiny blue gift box with both hands, protecting it as if it were the most valuable treasure in the room. Ethan smiled gently and whispered that they should stay close together, enjoy the evening, and quietly head home once the ceremony ended. Lily nodded, but her bright eyes remained fixed on the woman speaking beneath the dazzling lights. As applause echoed through the ballroom, and Victoria stepped away from the podium to greet donors, Lily suddenly slipped away from her father's side. "Lily," Ethan called softly, weaving through clusters of guests with growing concern. She continued forward with innocent determination, carefully making her way between elegantly dressed strangers who instinctively stepped aside. Conversations faded one after another as curious eyes followed the little girl crossing the enormous ballroom. Photographers lowered their cameras, uncertain whether to capture the unexpected interruption or respectfully wait. Victoria noticed the child approaching and politely dismissed the executive beside her before kneeling slightly, so they stood at nearly the same height. Lily smiled with complete sincerity and held out the tiny blue box using both hands. "This is for you," she whispered. "My daddy says people who help others deserve something made with love." Ethan finally reached them, slightly out of breath, apologizing for the interruption while gently placing a reassuring hand on Lily's shoulder. His face revealed embarrassment, humility, and quiet dignity rather than panic. Victoria looked from the father to the daughter before accepting the small package with surprising tenderness. The room became so silent that the distant sound of silverware being arranged in the banquet hall seemed impossibly loud. Slowly, she untied the ribbon and lifted the lid. Inside rested a simple handmade friendship bracelet woven from blue and white thread beside a folded note written in careful childish handwriting. Victoria unfolded the paper with steady hands and read the short message. Her confident expression dissolved almost instantly. Her eyes glistened. Her lips trembled. She pressed the bracelet gently against her palm as though it belonged to someone she had loved long ago. Hundreds of guests watched without speaking, unable to understand why one tiny handmade gift had accomplished what decades of wealth, recognition, and success never could. And in that extraordinary silence, before anyone knew the story hidden inside the bracelet, one little act of kindness quietly began changing 3 lives forever. The applause that had filled the ballroom the night before faded into memory, but the silence that followed the little blue gift remained with Victoria Hayes long after every guest had gone home. Before sunrise painted the Chicago skyline with pale gold, she sat alone in her office, the handmade bracelet resting beside her morning coffee instead of the stack of contracts waiting for her signature. She had built an empire by making decisions in seconds, yet she had spent nearly an hour reading the tiny handwritten note over and over again. The words were simple, innocent, and free from expectation, but they reached a place in her heart that success had never been able to touch. Across the city, Ethan Brooks began another ordinary day exactly as he had countless times before. He unlocked the doors of the neighborhood community center just after 8 o'clock in the morning, carrying a small toolbox in one hand and a box of donated books in the other. The building was old, the paint had begun to fade, and one of the hallway lights still flickered despite several repairs. But Ethan greeted the place with the same grateful smile he offered every morning. He believed that people did not need perfect buildings to rebuild their lives. They simply needed someone who believed they still mattered. Lily skipped through the entrance, carrying her backpack, before carefully placing fresh paper flowers she had made on the welcome desk. She greeted every volunteer by name, making even the oldest visitors smile before their day had truly begun. Ethan spent the morning tightening loose chair legs, repairing a broken toy train for a young boy, organizing canned food for the pantry, and helping an elderly neighbor carry groceries from her car to the front door. No cameras followed him. No reporters wrote stories about him. Nobody applauded when he quietly finished each task and immediately looked for the next person who needed help. His kindness had become so natural that most people no longer noticed it, much like the steady rhythm of a clock that only seemed important once it stopped. Around noon, several neighborhood children gathered in the reading corner where Ethan patiently read a story aloud while Lily sat beside him, happily turning each page at exactly the right moment. Their laughter filled the room with a warmth that expensive decorations could never create. Meanwhile, in the tallest office tower overlooking the city, Victoria found herself unable to concentrate during executive meetings. Financial projections, investment reports, and expansion plans blurred together while her thoughts returned again and again to the father whose first instinct had been to apologize for interrupting an elegant event rather than seek attention for himself. She quietly asked her assistant to learn more about the community center listed on Ethan's guest badge, requesting only its location and daily schedule without revealing the reason. Late that afternoon, before leaving work, she slipped the blue and white bracelet onto her wrist. It was simple beside the luxury watch she normally wore, yet somehow it felt far more valuable. As sunlight disappeared behind the Chicago skyline, Ethan locked the community center after another long day of serving others, never realizing that someone across the city had begun searching not for a wealthy donor or influential businessman, but for an ordinary father whose quiet dignity had accomplished what money never could, and whose story was only beginning to unfold. 2 days passed, yet the little blue bracelet never left Victoria Hayes's wrist. Every morning, she fastened it before attending board meetings, and every evening she found herself turning it gently between her fingers, as if it carried an answer she had been searching for her entire life. On the third evening, after the last executive had left the building and the city lights shimmered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, she quietly opened the small blue gift box once again. This time she noticed something she had overlooked before. Tucked beneath the folded note was a tiny pressed white daisy, carefully preserved between two pieces of wax paper. She lifted it with extraordinary care, remembering how her own father used to bring home simple wildflowers after long days of construction work. He would laugh and tell her that beautiful things did not have to be expensive. They only had to be given with love. The memory arrived so suddenly that Victoria slowly sat down, unable to stop the tears filling her eyes. She had spent years building a company admired across America, speaking before thousands of people, appearing on magazine covers, and negotiating deals worth billions of dollars. Yet she had forgotten the gentle lessons that had shaped her long before success entered her life. She unfolded Lily's handwritten note again. The careful letters were slightly uneven, but every word carried remarkable sincerity. The little girl had written that her father always said kindness became bigger every time someone shared it, and that maybe the bracelet would remind the lady to smile whenever work became difficult. Victoria smiled through quiet tears because she realized the child had unknowingly repeated almost the same words her own father had spoken decades earlier. At that very moment, across the city, Ethan, Brooks, and Lily were finishing another evening at the community center. Together, they stacked chairs after an after-school reading program, collected crayons left on tables, and thanked every volunteer before locking the doors. As they walked toward the nearby bus stop beneath the cool Chicago evening sky, Lily looked up at her father with innocent curiosity. She asked whether the important lady had liked the gift. Ethan smiled gently before answering that sometimes the best gifts were never measured by whether someone said thank you. Sometimes they simply reminded people that they were not alone. Lily nodded thoughtfully before slipping her small hand into his. Neither of them imagined that those simple words would soon change someone else's future. Back inside her office, Victoria carefully placed the pressed daisy back in the box before walking toward the window overlooking the glowing skyline. For the first time in many years, the city no longer looked like a collection of business opportunities. Instead, she wondered how many ordinary people quietly carried extraordinary hearts without anyone noticing. She reached for her assistant's note containing the address of the neighborhood community center and read it once more. After a long moment of reflection, she quietly folded the paper and placed it inside her coat pocket instead of her briefcase. She did not want a camera crew, a security detail, or a formal announcement. She wanted to understand the man whose daughter had restored a forgotten piece of her childhood without ever asking for anything in return. As the office lights switched off one by one behind her, Victoria walked into the quiet hallway with a decision that would change the direction of her life, determined to arrive not as the billionaire everyone recognized, but simply as another volunteer hoping to learn why. Genuine kindness always seemed strongest in the hearts of those who possessed the least. The following Saturday morning arrived wrapped in crisp winter air as sunlight spilled gently across the sidewalks outside the neighborhood community center. Ethan Brooks was already unloading donated folding tables from the back of an aging pickup truck, while cheerful volunteers prepared for the weekly family breakfast. Inside, children colored paper snowflakes, fresh coffee filled the room with a comforting aroma, and laughter echoed through hallways that had become a second home for countless families. Just as the front door opened, a woman wearing a simple cream-colored sweater, blue jeans, and a dark wool coat stepped quietly inside, carrying a cardboard box filled with new children's books. Very few people would have recognized Victoria Hayes without her tailored business suits, polished boardrooms, and constant media attention. She had left her driver several blocks away and arrived alone, hoping that for one morning she could simply be another pair of helping hands. Ethan looked up from arranging chairs and greeted her with the same welcoming smile he offered every newcomer. He thanked her for bringing books and introduced himself without the slightest hint that he recognized the famous executive standing before him. Victoria returned the smile and simply introduced herself as Victoria, saying that she had heard wonderful things about the center and wanted to volunteer on weekends if they needed extra help. Ethan did not ask about her career, her background, or her reasons for coming. Instead, he handed her a volunteer name tag, pointed toward a stack of donated supplies, and asked whether she would mind helping organize the children's reading corner. She accepted immediately, surprised by how naturally she was treated like everyone else. Throughout the morning, they worked side by side without discussing wealth, business, or success. Ethan repaired a bookshelf while explaining how every donated item deserved another chance because people often needed second chances just as much. Victoria carefully sorted storybooks by reading level, occasionally glancing toward Ethan as she watched him encourage nervous children, comfort anxious parents, and quietly solve problems before anyone even realized they existed. There was no performance in his kindness. It flowed from him as naturally as breathing. Near lunchtime, Lily skipped into the reading area, carrying colorful construction paper for an afternoon craft project. She smiled brightly at the new volunteer before suddenly stopping. Her curious eyes drifted toward Victoria's wrist where the blue and white bracelet rested beneath the sleeve of her sweater. Lily's face slowly brightened with unmistakable recognition. She stepped closer and asked softly whether she liked wearing it. Victoria looked down at the bracelet before meeting the little girl's eyes. Her voice became almost a whisper as she answered that she wore it every single day because it reminded her that the most valuable things in life could never be purchased. Lily smiled with innocent satisfaction before hugging the box of paper against her chest and happily returning to her craft table. Ethan noticed a brief exchange, but simply assumed his daughter was making another new friend, something she had always done with remarkable ease. As the afternoon sunlight stretched across the wooden floor, neighbors arrived carrying homemade soup, donated blankets, and grocery bags for families facing difficult times. Without planning it, Victoria found herself washing dishes beside retired teachers, serving lunch beside college students, and laughing with children who had no idea they were speaking with one of the most successful women in America. For the first time in many years, nobody admired her because of her title. They appreciated her because she stayed after everyone else to wipe the tables, stack the chairs, and quietly help wherever she was needed. And as Ethan thanked every volunteer before locking the doors that evening, Victoria realized she had not spent the day escaping her old life at all. She had spent it discovering the kind of life her father had always hoped she would choose. The following weeks unfolded with quiet consistency, and before anyone realized it, Saturday mornings at the community center no longer felt complete unless Victoria arrived carrying another box of books, art supplies, or homemade muffins she insisted were baked from an old family recipe. She never arrived with an announcement, never sought attention, and never allowed anyone to introduce her as anything more than another volunteer. Ethan appreciated that humility without knowing how extraordinary it truly was. To him, she was simply someone who listened carefully, worked tirelessly, and treated every child with genuine respect. One chilly afternoon, as Ethan examined another section of the aging building, he sighed softly while looking at a leaking ceiling tile and cracked window frame. The center had served generations of neighborhood families, but time had left visible scars on every hallway. The heating system struggled during the winter, several classrooms needed repairs, and the playground outside had begun showing signs of age. Lily noticed her father studying the worn walls and quietly slipped her hand into his. She smiled and reminded him that good places could become beautiful again because people cared about them. Ethan smiled back and told her that hope often started long before the repairs did. Victoria overheard the conversation from across the room while organizing donated puzzles, and those simple words stayed with her for the rest of the day. That evening, after leaving the center, she returned to her office, not to review business reports, but to meet privately with the director of her charitable foundation. She explained that she wanted to support a neighborhood community center that had quietly transformed lives for years without asking for recognition. Her only request was absolute anonymity. No press release. No rivonkutin ceremony. No public statement. The foundation would simply provide everything necessary to restore the building, improve the classrooms, replace the aging heating system, renovate the playground, and create a modern reading space for local children. Several weeks later, construction crews arrived early on a Monday morning after careful planning and coordination had been completed. They carried official permits and a letter explaining that an anonymous donor had chosen the community center for a complete renovation because of its lasting impact on local families. Ethan stood in stunned silence as contractors carefully described every improvement that would take place over the coming weeks. He asked several times whether there had been a mistake, but every document confirmed the same remarkable truth. Someone had believed in their mission enough to invest in its future without expecting anything in return. News spread quickly through the neighborhood, and volunteers responded with renewed energy. Local carpenters offered extra hours after work. Retired teachers donated new classroom materials. Nearby restaurants delivered meals for construction crews, and families gathered every evening to help clean and organize supplies. Kindness multiplied almost effortlessly, inspiring one generous act after another. Victoria continued volunteering every weekend exactly as before, never hinting that she already knew every detail of the renovation schedule. She spent her afternoons painting classroom shelves beside college students, planting flowers with neighborhood children, and laughing as Lily proudly showed her handmade decorations that would soon brighten the new reading room. Watching the community come together, Victoria realized that the anonymous donation had never been the true miracle. The real miracle was Ethan himself. Without wealth, influence, or recognition. He had quietly built a place where people naturally wanted to become better neighbors, kinder friends, and stronger families. As the final rays of sunlight warmed the freshly repaired entrance one evening, Ethan looked around at smiling volunteers filling the courtyard and spoke almost to himself, saying that perhaps kindness really did grow every time someone chose to share it. Victoria lowered her eyes toward the blue and white bracelet still resting on her wrist, smiled through grateful tears that no one else noticed, and silently thanked a little girl whose simple gift had reminded her that the greatest investments were never measured by money, but by the lives forever changed through quiet dignity, compassion, and hope. Winter slowly gave way to early spring, and the neighborhood community center stood brighter than it had in decades. Fresh paint reflected the morning sunlight. Colorful murals filled once empty walls. The repaired playground echoed with children's laughter, and every classroom carried the unmistakable feeling that hope had found a permanent home. Yet Ethan Brooks still arrived before everyone else each morning, unlocking the front doors with the same quiet smile he had worn long before a single wall had been restored. He often reminded new volunteers that beautiful buildings meant very little unless they were filled with beautiful hearts. Victoria Hayes continued arriving every Saturday without ceremony, carrying craft supplies, homemade cookies, and boxes of donated books instead of business folders. She had become such a familiar face that neighborhood children greeted her before she even reached the entrance. Nobody treated her differently because nobody knew who she truly was. And for the first time since she had built her company, she found complete happiness in remaining unknown. One Friday evening, the community prepared for its annual holiday concert, a tradition that brought together families from every corner of the neighborhood. Parents decorated the stage with evergreen garlands and warm white lights, while volunteers arranged rows of folding chairs beneath handmade, snowflake decorations created by the children. Ethan carefully tested the sound system, helped move musical instruments into place, and encouraged every nervous performer with patient words that made fear quietly disappear. Lily had spent weeks practicing a simple song with the children's choir, and although she admitted feeling butterflies in her stomach, she smiled every time her father reminded her that singing with love mattered far more than singing perfectly. As the concert began, the renovated hall filled with applause, joyful music, and grateful families celebrating another year together. Victoria sat quietly among the audience, wearing the familiar blue and white bracelet beneath the sleeve of her winter coat. She watched children perform with genuine admiration, but her eyes returned again and again to Ethan, who remained near the side of the stage, making sure every child felt safe, confident, and encouraged before stepping into the spotlight. When the final song ended, the audience rose together in heartfelt applause. Just as everyone believed the evening had reached its conclusion, Lily stepped away from the choir, carrying a large sheet of folded drawing paper. She walked directly toward Victoria with the same fearless sincerity she had shown at the charity gala months earlier. Smiling brightly, she handed over the drawing and said that she had made something new because families should always remember the people who made them feel loved. Victoria slowly unfolded the picture. Drawn in bright crayons were three smiling figures standing hand in hand beneath a glowing sun. One was clearly Ethan. One was Lily. The third wore a blue and white bracelet and stood beside them with the words, "Our friend forever," written carefully across the top. Victoria stared at the drawing as tears quietly filled her eyes once again. She gently pressed the picture against her heart, unable to speak for several long moments. Around the room, conversations faded into complete silence as families watched a woman they believed to be an ordinary volunteer overcome with genuine emotion. Ethan looked toward Victoria, then toward Lily, finally understanding that his daughter's simple gifts carried a remarkable ability to reach hearts that adults often believed were beyond healing. He smiled with quiet gratitude, not because of the tears he witnessed, but because he realized that kindness given freely always found its way home. In that peaceful silence, surrounded by music, laughter, and a community transformed through compassion, Victoria understood with absolute certainty that she had not merely discovered a neighborhood center. She had discovered the family her heart had been searching for all along. And no achievement in her remarkable career would ever equal the priceless feeling of finally belonging somewhere because of love instead of success. The weeks following the holiday concert brought an unexpected change that no advertising campaign, business strategy, or public relations effort could ever have created. Families who had attended the performance began sharing heartfelt stories about the remarkable community center where kindness seemed as natural as breathing. Neighbors spoke about volunteers who never asked for recognition, children who welcomed strangers like lifelong friends, and one quiet father whose steady example inspired everyone around him. Local newspapers published short features celebrating the growing spirit of service spreading through the neighborhood, while community organizations reached out offering books, school supplies, musical instruments, and volunteer support. Ethan Brooks accepted every donation with sincere gratitude, but he always reminded visitors that the greatest gift anyone could bring was their willingness to care for another person. Every conversation ended with the same gentle smile and the same humble belief that communities became stronger one small act of kindness at a time. Victoria Hayes watched these changes unfold with quiet amazement. She continued arriving every weekend as an ordinary volunteer, helping children organize art projects, serving meals during family gatherings, and reading storybooks beside Lily in the newly renovated reading room. Although a few people who followed business news occasionally looked at her with uncertain curiosity, they respected her wish to remain simply Victoria, choosing to value her presence instead of her public identity. She had never felt more accepted than she did among people who appreciated her character before her accomplishments. One afternoon, a local television reporter visited the community center after hearing about the extraordinary volunteer movement growing throughout the neighborhood. The reporter politely asked Ethan whether he would agree to a short interview highlighting his leadership and the remarkable transformation of the center. Ethan smiled kindly, thanked the reporter for visiting, and quietly explained that there was nothing special about him. He gestured toward the volunteers painting classrooms, teenagers tutoring younger students, grandparents reading with children, and parents preparing meals in the kitchen. He said that if the cameras truly wished to tell an inspiring story, they should point toward the people who chose to show up every week expecting nothing in return. The reporter stood silently for a moment before lowering the microphone, recognizing that genuine humility rarely needed dramatic words. Victoria watched the exchange from across the room while arranging donated books onto freshly painted shelves. She had negotiated billion-dollar agreements with remarkable confidence, yet she had never witnessed someone turn away public praise with such effortless grace. In that simple moment, she understood why Lily possessed such uncommon kindness. Children often became living reflections of the values they witnessed every day, and Lily had spent her entire life watching a father who measured success by lives touched rather than attention received. Later that evening, after the last family had gone home, Ethan and Victoria remained behind to straighten chairs and sweep the community hall before locking the doors. The work was quiet, almost peaceful, accompanied only by the soft sound of brooms across polished floors and distant laughter from children playing outside. Victoria paused for a moment and thanked Ethan for building a place where people remembered how to care for one another. Ethan looked around the room before answering with his familiar gentle smile that he had never built it alone. He said every person who walked through those doors carrying compassion added another brick to its true foundation. Victoria lowered her eyes toward the blue and white bracelet resting on her wrist and realized that the little gift had grown into something far greater than either of them could have imagined. It had become a living reminder that quiet dignity could inspire an entire city, and that the strongest leaders were often the ones who never asked anyone to follow them at all. Spring slowly settled across Chicago, covering neighborhood parks with fresh green leaves and filling the community center with even greater energy than before. The renovated classrooms echoed with music lessons, reading circles, and cheerful conversations that continued long after sunset. Ethan Brooks remained exactly the same man he had always been, arriving before dawn to unlock the doors, checking every classroom before children arrived, and greeting every family with the same patient smile that made everyone feel welcome. Victoria Hayes continued volunteering every Saturday and gradually found herself staying longer each week. At first, she had planned to help for only a few hours, but now entire afternoons slipped away as she painted art projects with children, organized library shelves beside retired teachers, prepared sandwiches for family lunches, and quietly joined every activity without seeking recognition. Somewhere along the way, she stopped counting the hours because for the first time in many years, time no longer felt like something that had to be managed. It simply became something to enjoy. Lily noticed the change before anyone else. One afternoon, while helping plant flowers outside the entrance, she looked at her father with a playful smile and asked why Miss Victoria always seemed happiest whenever she was at the community center. Ethan laughed softly before answering that some places reminded people of who they truly wanted to become. Lily nodded thoughtfully before replying that perhaps the center was becoming Miss Victoria's home too. Ethan smiled at the innocent observation but said nothing more, allowing the gentle silence to carry its own meaning. Over the following weeks, simple routines slowly became treasured traditions. Every Saturday morning, Ethan and Victoria worked together arranging tables before volunteers arrived. After lunch, they often repaired donated furniture, sorted books, or walked through the playground, making sure everything remained safe for the children. Their conversations rarely centered on careers or achievements. Instead, they spoke about favorite childhood memories, family traditions, old recipes, meaningful books, and the quiet satisfaction that came from helping another person smile. Victoria gradually shared stories about her father, describing how he had believed that respect could never be purchased and that success meant very little unless it lifted someone else along the way. Ethan listened with genuine attention, never interrupting, never offering unnecessary advice, simply allowing her memories to be heard. In return, he spoke about raising Lily after losing his wife years earlier and how every difficult day became easier whenever his daughter reminded him that hope usually arrived in small moments instead of dramatic miracles. Their friendship grew without promises, without grand declarations, and without either of them realizing exactly when quiet companionship had become something much deeper. One warm Saturday evening after the volunteers finished cleaning the center, they remained outside watching neighborhood children race bicycles along the sidewalk, while parents laughed together beneath the soft glow of newly installed garden lights. Lily ran over carrying 3 paper cups filled with homemade lemonade and proudly handed one to each of them before sitting between them on the wooden bench. She leaned comfortably against her father while smiling at Victoria as though the 3 of them had shared countless evenings together. Nobody spoke for several peaceful moments. The gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers across the courtyard, while distant laughter filled the fading daylight. Victoria looked around the neighborhood that had once been completely unfamiliar and quietly realized that she no longer felt like a visitor. She felt expected. She felt appreciated. Most importantly, she felt accepted for the person she was rather than the title she carried. Ethan glanced toward her with a warm, understanding smile, grateful not because extraordinary circumstances had brought them together, but because ordinary acts of kindness had slowly woven 3 separate lives into something that already felt remarkably like family, proving once again that the strongest bonds are often formed not through grand moments, but through countless quiet days shared with dignity, trust, and genuine compassion. Summer arrived quietly, bringing long golden evenings that seemed to linger over the neighborhood community center as if even the setting sun wished to stay a little longer. The gardens surrounding the building overflowed with colorful flowers planted by neighborhood children. The playground echoed with joyful laughter from sunrise until dusk, and every window reflected a place that had become far more than brick and wood. It had become a home for hope. Ethan Brooks still unlocked the front doors before anyone else arrived, carrying the same worn toolbox he had owned for years, even though there were now very few repairs left to make. He often smiled to himself because the strongest foundations were no longer made of fresh paint or new furniture. They were built from trust, compassion, and people who continued showing up for one another. Victoria Hayes had quietly become one of those people. She no longer counted the weekends she spent volunteering because serving the community had become as natural as attending the executive meetings that still filled her weekdays. Her colleagues noticed she smiled more often. Friends commented that she seemed lighter, calmer, and somehow younger. They assumed she had discovered a new business success, but the truth was far simpler. She had rediscovered the part of herself that her father had always hoped she would never lose. One warm Saturday evening, the neighborhood gathered for its annual summer picnic on the lawn outside the community center. Families unfolded picnic blankets beneath large oak trees, while children chased bubbles across the grass, and local musicians filled the air with gentle acoustic melodies. Volunteers shared homemade casseroles, fresh lemonade, apple pie, and recipes that had been passed through generations. There were no reserved tables, no important guests, and no speeches. Everyone belonged equally. Victoria arrived carrying a woven basket filled with homemade chocolate chip cookies prepared from her father's old recipe. Lily spotted her from across the lawn and ran forward with the same joyful enthusiasm she had shown the day she first carried a tiny blue gift across a crowded ballroom. Without hesitation, she wrapped her arms around Victoria in a heartfelt hug before proudly taking the basket to share with the other children. Ethan watched the moment with quiet gratitude, recognizing that some of life's greatest miracles happened so gently they almost escaped notice. As twilight settled across the park, neighbors gathered on the restored wooden bench outside the community center where Ethan, Victoria, and Lily sat together watching children laugh beneath strings of glowing lights. No one spoke for a while because the peaceful silence itself felt complete. Victoria glanced down at the blue and white bracelet that still rested around her wrist, now slightly faded from months of daily wear, yet more precious than ever. She thought about the frightened little girl she had once been, the lonely woman she had become, and the unexpected family she had found because one child believed love should always be shared. Ethan looked toward the family surrounding them and quietly said that kindness had an extraordinary way of returning home, even when people stopped expecting it. Victoria smiled through grateful eyes and answered that perhaps kindness had never really been lost. Sometimes it simply waited for someone brave enough to offer the first small gift. Lily slipped one hand into her father's and the other into Victoria's, smiling toward the glowing community center that had changed all of their lives without ever asking for recognition. Above them, the first stars slowly appeared across the Chicago sky, while laughter drifted gently through the warm summer air. There were no grand announcements, no dramatic endings, and no applause waiting beyond that peaceful evening. There was only quiet dignity, lasting gratitude, second chances fulfilled, and three hearts forever connected by a simple act of kindness that proved the greatest miracles are rarely loud enough to capture the world's attention, yet they are always powerful enough to change the world of someone who needed hope the most.